G'day, mate. Luke Forward here. Great to do another show with you. Today, I want to talk about a book by Nicholas Wade, came out a couple of years ago, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. And what John Derbyshire calls the most meaty chapter in the book is Chapter 7, The Recasting of Human Nature. And it begins with a quote from Tom Sowell. We need to confront the most blatant fact that has persisted across centuries of social history: vast differences in productivity among peoples and the economic and other consequences of such differences. Not a particularly politically correct quote from Tom Sowell. So I remember when I was studying economics at UCLA and also at Sierra Community College, we would study economics with the idea that all human inputs are basically the same, that it wouldn't matter if you're employing people from the Sudan or New Guinea or Japan or from Canada or Australia or England, all human inputs are the same. So Nicholas Wade, longtime science writer at the New York Times. He published over 1,000 articles there. Each of the major civilizations has developed the institutions appropriate for its circumstances and survival. But these institutions, though heavily imbued with cultural traditions, rest on a bedrock of genetically shaped human behavior. When a civilization produces a distinctive set of institutions that endures for many generations, that is a sign of a supporting suite of variations in the genes that influence human social behavior. So, for an example of modern forms of evolution, all dog breeds that we have today were developed in the last 500 years. Dogs have been selected by humans and bred so that they behave less like wolves and more like man's best friend. So that has been accomplished by deliberate human selection. That is a sign. And so are there selection pressures that are operating on human beings the same way? That's one of the focuses of this book by Nicholas Wade. I did interview him in 2014, as did Jared Taylor. So I'll play a little bit from Jared Taylor's
I'm Jared
interview.
Taylor with American Renaissance. It's my pleasure to introduce Nicholas Wade, who has joined me today to talk about his most recent book, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. Mr. Wade was born in England and educated at Eton and Cambridge before coming to the United States in 1970. He is a professional science writer and well known for his 20 years with the New York Times, from which he retired last year. He's the author of many books, most recently, Before the Dawn.
Oh no. So what happened here? Oh no. Just when it was getting good, the video paused. All right, let's still on the air, but I'll just pause him. Doggone it. Just when it was getting good. So this show started late because I was working on my character defects. I had a talk with my sponsor today and I have a lot of anxiety about learning new technology. I had a lot of issues, audio issues with Windows 10. And so they were plaguing me this morning. And let's see, is the stream? Is anyone there? Let's see if anyone is out there listening to the stream. Together. I think we're still on the air. Yeah, okay, we're still on the air. So yeah, I had a lot of anxiety about my audio technology, audio drivers with Windows 10. And so I was doing this work for one of my 12-step programs, identifying my character defect of fear. I made a list of 100 fears, and I selected 12 that are operating in my life with particular power. And so one of them is learning new technology and dealing with computer troubles, Windows 10 audio driver issues, and combining Voice Meter Banana with Streamlabs OBS And so this is what I wrote out this morning. Fear of technology. It serves me by helping me to stay focused on what I do best, which is not technology. It helps me to avoid wasting time. Trying to learn new technology helps me to stay safe and comfortable. How my excessive fear of learning technology and dealing with computer issues hurts me. It constricts my life, reduces my ability to learn with joy, causes me anxiety and anger, warps my sense of reality, reduces my ability to be of service to others. What if instead I came out of the character asset of faith? Then that would perhaps expand my life, reduce my anxiety, unhappiness, and anger. It would open my mind and allow me more happiness, peace, joy, and ability to be of service to others. Then I had other fears here that I listed. Fear of being married. How does this fear help me? It helps me live the life I want, not waste time dating women I'm not interested in. How does it hurt me? It constricts my life so that I'm not living fully. If instead I came out of the character asset of faith, of generosity and love, I would perhaps lead a fuller life, have a deeper connection with God and with other people, and I'd get to experience more of what God and life has to offer, more in reality, and more likely to be of service for others. Then I also have a fear of not being married. So this helps me to remember that there may be an important part of life that I am missing out on. God may want me to experience more of life. How this fear hurts me. It reduces my joy in living, which makes me less appealing, less of service to others, more anxious, and less in reality. Instead, I came out of faith that God runs the world. I'd be more aligned with God and with other people. I would have more opportunities to expand my life and to live more fully in life and to be of more service to other people. So when I was doing this work on my fears, I noticed how I didn't really want to let them go. Some of them I just wanted to hold on to because I think we know ourselves by our fears. Like we know ourselves by our familiar resentments. Like, who am I? Like, I'm someone who's got a resentment against my father, or I'm someone who's always hated his bosses, or I'm someone who does not like to be criticized on this particular point. And so we develop these fears, these resentments. They become increasingly strong. They become straitjackets, but we know ourselves by these familiar fears and resentments. Just as, to use an analogy, we know ourselves by familiar layers of unnecessary muscular tension. Like we get used to, say, tightening our shoulders, tightening our lower back, furrowing our brow when dealing with anything challenging, tightening around the lips and around the eyes. So we develop these habits of needless tension and compression, and they become so familiar that we identify ourselves with these habits. And so we don't know who we might be if we let go of this unnecessary muscular tension, say in our lower back or in our shoulders or around the eyes or around the forehead. It'd be really easy for me when I'm struggling with things to start furrowing my brow. It's like, oh, kind of just, you notice how when I went, oh, just kind of experience that. There's just kind of a collapse of the body, kind of pulling down and in. When the body pulls down and in, it tightens up. And when we do that thousands and thousands of times in our life, it becomes familiar. And that's how we know ourselves, by these familiar habits of muscular compression, pulling down, by our fears, by our resentments. And so when we start looking at letting go of our fears, letting go of our resentments, then it's like, wait, who am I then? This is a step into the unknown. So I know myself by my tight shoulders. I know myself by my unnecessary fears and resentments. Okay. And then another fear that I have that is out of proportion to reality. I have a fear of angry people and of confrontation. So being in this character defect of fear, excessive fear, helps me to stay safe. It hurts me, however. By secluding me from much of life, it keeps me poor, small, and weak, and kind of insular and selfish and self-centered. If instead I came at life with a spirit of generosity and love and faith-seeking, my life would expand. I'd have less needless fear of angry people and confrontation. I may be more aligned with God. I'd be more at ease in the world and with other people. I'd be of more service to others. I'd be more willing and useful at tackling tough situations, at standing up for what I believe in, and I may approach new levels of maturity, spirituality, and prosperity. So let's see if I can get Jared Taylor talking to Nicholas
which
Wade.
appeared in 2006, and The Faith Instinct, which was published in 2009. And of course, he is the author of A Troublesome Inheritance, which was published just this year. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Wade, for agreeing to join me in this conversation.
My pleasure.
First, might I ask you to tell me, in your words, what this book is about? What is its most important message in your view?
Well, there are two principal themes in the book. The first is to establish that race has a biological basis, and that the difference between races consists of what geneticists call relative allele frequency. So this is a straightforward science story, but of course it's controversial politically because many people believe or say they believe that race has no biological basis. So the second part of the book, I should say first that the purpose of the first part of the book to establish that race does have a biological basis is not because I have any great interest in race as such, but I'm very interested in human evolution, recent human evolution. And you can't study recent human evolution unless you acknowledge the fact of races, because each race has a different evolutionary history, because we've all traced different paths through historical time. So if you cannot acknowledge race exists, then you're severely hung up on looking at the recent evolutionary past of the human population, which I think is a subject of great interest to everyone. So the second theme of the book then is more speculative, and it's asking, well, what changes have there been in recent human evolution that might have an impact on the modern world? And I suggest that natural selection pays particular importance to social behavior, because we are, after all, a supremely social species, and of all aspects of our brain and body, the one that natural selection is least likely to ignore is that of our social behavior, because the nature of our society determines our survival. So the second half of the book is sort of gathering such evidence as exists. There's some, but not much of it, that points to the idea that our social behavior has changed over our recent evolutionary history.
Earlier in your answer, you said that people believe or say they believe that there's no biological basis for race. Why do you think that this idea has gained such currency? It seems like such an odd position to take just from an intuitive point of view, looking at the world around us.
Yes, it's been taken largely for historical reasons that began shortly after the Second World War, when people were particularly conscious of the pernicious effects of racism, and the idea developed that the way to abolish racism was simply to deny that races exist. So it was a kind of simple-minded idea.
Okay, that's just a brief excerpt of Jared Taylor's conversation with Nicholas Wade. Nicholas Wade wrote over 1,000 articles in the New York Times. And just as I'm pulling one up, suddenly New York Times is not displaying it. Okay, so I'll get back to the book. Historians sometimes speak of national character, but although many might agree that the German and Japanese characters say differ in ways that have deeply affected their respective histories, there is less agreement on how to define the significant elements of national character, and without some objective measure, attempts to describe national character easily slip into caricature. So I'll play a little more from the podcast.
But people have stuck with it ever since, and I think it's time they abandoned it.
Yes, it does suggest to me that to have taken a position that seems so counterintuitive suggests just how desperately people feel the need to fight what they conceive of as racism. That if you have to fight racism by denying something that seems so biologically obvious, it seems to me you're in pretty dire straits.
I think so. It also implies a highly patronizing attitude to those you're trying to convince, as if if the holders of this view believe that although they themselves can, that racism can never be abolished unless you sort of brainwash people into thinking there is no real difference between human races.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I want to switch to this New York Times article that Nicholas Wade wrote July 30, 2002, challenging the widely held view that race is a biologically meaningless concept. Leading population geneticist says that race is helpful for understanding ethnic differences in disease and response to drugs. The geneticist Dr. Neil Risch of Stanford University says that genetic differences have arisen among people living on different continents, and that race, referring to geographically based ancestry, is a valid way of categorizing these differences. Dr. Risch's position was prompted by an editorial last year in the New England Journal of Medicine asserting that race is biologically meaningless. One in Nature Genetics warning of the confusion and potential harmful effects of using race as a variable in medical research. Dr. Risch's assertion in a paper in the online journal Genome Biology, hope everyone is up to date on their subscription to Genome Biology, comes as researchers and physicians are trying to interpret the DNA data streaming from the Human Genome Project and to make sense of the fact that the pattern of data differs among ethnic groups. All humans have the bulk of their genetic heritage in common and possess the same set of genes, but because of mutations or changes in DNA, each gene comes in slightly different versions, and some of them are more common in one ethnic group than another. These genetic differences often have medical significance since some occur among genes that affect susceptibility to disease and the response to drugs. In other words, if you're not a racially profiling doctor, to quote Dr. Sally Satel, you're engaging in malpractice. It's long been known that some diseases are not evenly distributed. For example, a mutation that causes hemochromatosis, a disorder of iron metabolism, is rare or absent among Indians and Chinese, but occurs in 7.5% of Swedes. A common mutation that causes sickle cell anemia is prevalent among Africans, is thought to have originated among Bantu speakers before the Bantu expansion 2,000 years ago. So I'll play a little more of the podcast.
Well, you said that it was important to know, or at least you found it fascinating, and so do I, to look into the recent evolutionary history of our species, but that many scientists have been dissuaded from looking into this because it leads into this dangerous territory of race. Could you perhaps tell me what might we have learned had there not been this skittishness about race? In what fields would we be better informed if people had not been afraid to go into this dangerous territory?
Well, it's sort of hard to predict the future of scientific discovery, but I believe if scientists were so more explicit, were less fearful of the subject of race, and we would just be a lot further forward in understanding, at least in cataloging the various differences between human populations, and therefore in understanding the pressures of natural selection in our recent past. After all, when you find that that one gene or version of a gene known as an allele, if you find one allele of a gene has increased in frequency, then that tells you that that population was under a certain kind of pressure to adapt to some challenge, and this, of course, is a great way of understanding the events that have driven recent human history.
Well, I share your curiosity to know what it is that has changed different populations, but I suspect that aside from those who have a more historical and scientific interest in these matters, probably what is even more interesting to most people is simply to know or to acknowledge that different populations are themselves different.
Whoops. I was muted there. Just getting my handle on things. Okay, so back to this New York Times article. Lactose intolerance, the loss of the ability to digest lactose after weaning, is the default condition of humanity. But among Northern Europeans, the ability is often retained into adulthood. The reason is a mutation that may have been favored among early cattle farmers. The apparent correlation between race, genetic data, and disease has prompted at least two schools of thought among biomedical researchers. One holds that race is so poorly defined that it is not a reliable biological concept and should be banished, if possible, from scientific vocabulary. This is the view espoused by the New England Journal of Medicine. Many population geneticists, on the other hand, say it is essential to take race and ethnicity into account to understand each group's specific pattern of disease and to ensure that everyone shares equally in the expected benefits of genomic medicine. Okay, back to Jared Taylor and Nicholas Wade.
I think surely that's the area where people are terrified, simply to acknowledge that populations are different.
Yes, that's right. And I think there's sort of far less to fear from that knowledge than many people seem to think. I mean, most humans as individuals, I believe, are sort of very similar. We can all learn each other's languages. If you're exposed, whatever language you're exposed to from a young age, you can learn with perfect fluency. So this is a common trait throughout the human population. And since language is the sort of defining feature of the human mind, it tells us that our minds are pretty much alike. So I think if I can use an analogy with ants, who are the other species at the pinnacle of sociality, what nature has done is to keep us as individuals very much similar, but what it has changed is the nature of our societies. So the differences, the significant differences between human populations are ones that you cannot really see in an individual at all. There are very slight and subtle differences in social behavior. And it means individuals sort of cohere and cooperate together in slightly different ways. And that gives a slightly different cast to our various societies. That I think is the essential difference. And that's what I suggest in my book.
I suppose it's a matter of interpretation and degree, but I'm not sure it's correct to see the differences between, say, Central African society and Northern Asian society and dismiss them as the results of slight differences.
Well, of course, culture is extremely important, and I don't wish to sort of underplay the role of culture. So I think the differences that arise between societies, they are not totally cultural, as is the dogma among social anthropologists today. What I think is a more reasonable expectation is that although they are mostly cultural, there's a small genetic component. And this small genetic component is one that sort of lies at the basis of each society's institutions. Yes, there are large differences between societies around the world, but we can't say yet what part is due to genetics and what part is due to culture.
Okay, let me go back to this book by Nicholas Wade, came out in 2014, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. How could any objective measure be found of how human nature changes over time? Surprisingly enough, such measures exist even though they are indirect. They come from the work of economic historians such as Maristella Botticini and Zvi Eckstein, who have documented the role of education in Jewish history, and Gregory Clark, who has reconstructed English economic and social behavior in the 600 years that preceded the Industrial Revolution. The change brought about by the Industrial Revolution was not a visible alteration of people's lifestyle, such as living in houses instead of the wild, but a quantum leap in society's productivity. After stagnating for at least 5.5 centuries, so this is real income per person in England, this chart I'm about to show you, between the year 1200 and the year 2000s. So you see a staggering explosion in real income about 1850, starting in 1800, but really taking off by 1850. The preceding 6 centuries, very little difference. So did human nature change, or just institutions that changed? Okay, so English wages started to soar in the middle of the 18th century, reflecting an astonishing increase in the level of productive work. Productivity increases may seem like something that it could excite only an economist, but it made all the difference to people's lives. Before the Industrial Revolution, almost everyone but the nobility lived a notch or two above starvation. This subsistence level existence was a characteristic of agrarian economies, probably from the time that agriculture was first invented. So essentially, you could go all of human history. You could go from, say, 2,500 years ago to the year 1800. So someone from 2,500 years ago then stepped into the year 1800, and he would feel fairly comfortable. There hadn't been that much human change. Life in 1760 was pretty similar to life in 760 before the Common Era. Like, humanity had not evolved, developed, changed that much until about 1800. So Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Julius Caesar, Jesus of Nazareth, Rabbi Akiva, they'd been picked up from their time and dropped in 1770 London or New York. They wouldn't be completely disoriented, but they would be if they were dropped in 1870 London or New York. So basically, humanity went along for thousands and thousands of years, and there was very little change in its living standards. Living standards only exploded in the last part of the 18th century and really took off in the 19th century. Prior to that, thousands and thousands of years of human evolution, human society, and you didn't have much of an increase in living standards. The reason was not lack of inventiveness. England of 1800 possessed sailing ships, firearms, printing presses, and whole suites of technologies undreamed of by hunter-gatherers, but these technologies did not translate into better living standards for the average person. The reason was a catch-22 of agrarian economies that dates back probably to the beginning of agriculture. The catch is called the Malthusian trap because it was described by the Reverend Thomas Malthus in 1798 in his essay on the principle of population. Each time productivity improved and food became more plentiful, more infants survived to maturity and the extra mouths ate up the surplus. Within a generation, everyone was back to living just above starvation level. This lack of progress has been documented by the economic historian Gregory Clark of the University of California at Davis. Because of the existence of copious historical information in England, a country untouched by hostile invasion since 1066, Gregory Clark has been able to reconstruct many economic data series, such as the real day wages of English farm laborers from 1200 to 1800. Wages were almost exactly the same at the end of the period as they had been 600 years earlier. They sufficed to buy but a meager diet. Just a few veggie burgers and some soy protein shakes. But wages were not constant throughout the period. Between 1350 and 1450, they more than doubled. The cause was not some miraculous increase in productivity, it was the Black Death, which carried off some 50% of the population of Europe. In a Malthusian trap world, plagues are a blessing, at least for the survivors. With fewer mouths to feed, everyone ate better, and with a new scarcity of labor, workers could enjoy better wages. This era of plenty lasted a century until rising population numbers closed the jaws of the Malthusian trap once again. So the government essentially decides wage levels by how much immigration they allow. When you allow in a lot of immigration, it depresses wage levels. So, for example, wages in construction are essentially unchanged over the past 50 years because you've had so much immigration. Low-skilled labor is wages, real wages are about the same as they were 50 years ago. And that is virtually entirely attributable to the amount of immigration that the United States has allowed in. Australia, for example, has been much more selective with its immigration, and so has had much higher real wages. When I went back to Australia for a year after high school, so I went back in June 1984, and I was earning $20, $25 an hour. And when I came back to America and got a job in construction, I was earning $4 an hour. So the Australian dollar varied in value. So it was usually worth about 70 to 85 American cents. But still, in American dollar terms, that was a difference for me between earning $20, $22 an hour and earning $4 an hour. And that difference is entirely based on the level of immigration allowed. And that is decided by the government. So, for example, for all Trump's rhetoric about building the wall and stopping illegal immigration, he has governed as an open borders politician because he is the president of the United States. He has power to affect immigration levels, and he has not reduced immigration during his 2.5 years in office. He has governed as an open borders politician, even though his rhetoric is very restrictionist. So why didn't I stay in Australia then if Australia was so good? Because I was ambitious, and ambitious Australians tend to leave because Australia, you can only get so far in Australia. It's a nation of about 25 million now. When I was there, it was a nation of about 18 million. I wanted to make it big in the United States, in California. I wanted to return to California, go to college, ended up transferring to UCLA, which is an elite institution now, regarded as the best public university in the United States. So I was an ambitious young man. I was willing to put up with those lower wages now for low-skilled work. Now, when I go back to Australia, they ask me, well, you glad you went back to the States? Because all the friends that I left behind that I made 1984, 85, they all married. They all had kids. They all bought homes. They all have the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement accounts. And I have none of them. So on the face of it, doesn't look like I made a very good decision. So I'm going to collect myself here, play a little bit more from Jared Taylor talking with New York Times science editor Nicholas Wade about his book, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History.
But you are convinced that there is a genetic component, and that is what in the minds of many anthropologists and sociologists and even scientists cast you into outer darkness. Is that correct?
In brief, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm convinced that this is the case because it's not proven. But I lay out in my book the reasons for thinking it's quite plausible. And this is another reason, besides the question of the biological basis of race, why I have been attacked by socioanthropologists.
Yes. It is extraordinary just how closed one could describe the Western mind on these subjects. And I recall that you wrote, I think very convincingly, that one of the reasons why the West has been dominant in the last several hundred years is because of the open mind, the intellectually curious and the open mind that Westerners have had, which makes them open to new theories and to science. Would it not be correct to say that, at least in this respect, when it comes to the biological basis of population differences or even individual differences, that the Western mind is relatively closed? I can imagine, I know that the Chinese, for example, are much less.
Okay, I want to read a little bit from Steve Saylor. He wrote an essay on this article in Tachys Mag. It's called The Liberal Creationists. I'll show you this article here. He wrote this on April 30th of 2014. Nicholas Wade, the New York Times chief genetics reporter, has published 1,052 articles in the newspaper of record since 1983. For most of this century, Nicholas Wade has been methodically waging war in the science section of the New York Times against the liberal creationist myth that race isn't real. He has now written a definitive book on the existence of biological differences among races, Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. In his new book, Wade writes, ever since the first modern humans dispersed from the ancestral homelands in Northeast Africa, populations on each continent have evolved largely independent of one another, as each adapted to its regional environment. Because of these divisions in the human population, anyone interested in recent human evolution is almost inevitably studying human races, whether they wish to or not. To Wade, race isn't just skin deep. In fact, he finds the visual differences between races less significant than the behavioral. Evolution's strategy for adapting to radically different environments is to keep the human body much the same, but to change the social behavior. For example, in one study, the variant of the MAO-A gene most associated with aggression and delinquency was found in 5.2% of a sample of black males, but only 0.1% of Caucasian males, which may explain a lot. Nicholas Wade has also written Times editorials such as this 2011 one about the perfidiousness of the 1981 bestseller The Mismeasure of Man by the late Stephen Jay Gould, arch-druid of anti-Darwinian obscurantism. Takes only a few vigilantes to cow the whole campus, Wade notes on the baleful impact of witch sniffers, of whom Gould was one of the first in the 1970s when he led the mob after Harvard colleague Edward O. Wilson. In his new book, Wade quotes economist Paul Samuelson's famous assertion that knowledge advances funeral by funeral. And yet, a dozen years after Gould's funeral, the expert on crabs with a sonorous prose style is still cited as an unimpeachable authority on everything. Worse, practically nobody has even noticed Wade's dozen-year campaign to undermine the anti-science orthodoxy. The inability of a first-rate reporter like Wade, ensconced in the seeming bully pulpit of the New York Times, to make much of an impact makes for a fascinating case study of the zeitgeist power to cloud the minds of men. First documented what Wade was saying about race in the New York Times at VDare.com in 2003, then returned to the subject in 2006 when reviewing Wade's book on prehistory Before the Dawn. But I scratch out a living by reading very closely, so I notice things. Wade says with frustration in his latest book, the fact that human evolution has been recent, copious, and regional is not widely recognized, even though it has now been reported by many articles in the literature of genetics. The reason is in part that the knowledge is so new, and in part because it raises awkward challenges to deeply held conventional wisdom. Back to this podcast.
Less inhibited about this sort of thing than we are.
Yes, I don't know if I'd go quite so far as to say that the Western mind is becoming closed. I think this is a parochial problem of the academic left in the U.S. They're very fearful of each other, I think. So if you step out of line just a little, particularly in this subject, if you write anything that doesn't accord with current dogma about the nature of race, you'll be branded as a quote, scientific racist. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is between a scientific racist and a racist. And the bottom line is you'll be set upon as a racist and your career will be destroyed. So the whole of the academic left is sort of hoisted on its own petard. It's sort of captured by this monster it's created. which cannot brook criticism or dissenting thought. I think it's very sad, and it has to change someday. I just hope the sooner the better.
Well, you just mentioned in particular in the United States, but I think it's not restricted to the United States. In Europe, I think in some respects there are even greater strictures on what people are allowed to think.
Okay, let's get back to Steve Sailer's essay. As a nonfiction writer, Nicholas Wade is congenitally allergic to the kind of human interest padding that makes people believe whatever message Michael Lewis or Malcolm Gladwell decides to peddle. I think this is so important. I have found, to my chagrin, that the most glib tend to be the least worthy of our trust. So, for example, every charismatic rabbi that I've wanted to attach myself to has been running some kind of scam. Not talking necessarily illegal scam, but just a scam. I remember my father had his own non-denominational evangelical Christian foundation, Good News Unlimited, which relied on donations. And because it relied on donations, he would restrict himself from saying things that people didn't want to hear, such as about biblical criticism, that the authors of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, for example, were different authors. And my father would generally abstain from saying such things publicly because it would shake the faith of simple people and could perhaps imperil the financial viability of his non-denominational Christian foundation, Good News Unlimited, which relied upon donations. So I know from doing a lot of live streams, it becomes incredibly intoxicating to receive praise. And then the natural inclination is to just start orienting yourself towards that praise and giving people more and more of what they want, just as a plant grows towards the sun. But this will tend to often lead you in antisocial directions to ever more extreme directions as you keep seeking that hit of more and more praise. Now, Michael Lewis, Malcolm Gladwell, they tell wonderful stories, but their analysis frequently doesn't hold up, particularly Malcolm Gladwell. He's worse than useless. If you read a Malcolm Gladwell book, you will understand less about how the world works than before you read Malcolm Gladwell. He actually has a negative impact on your understanding of reality because that guy is so muddled and so confused. Now, Nicholas Wade is not going to peddle the popular lies that power a Malcolm Gladwell. Sailer writes, you know how popular science articles always include a description of the researcher's looks, personality, and laboratory as if that were relevant? Well, Nicholas Wade refuses to pander. Somebody's theory and evidence are good, then he doesn't care who said it or what kind of car he drives. A Troublesome Inheritance is based in sizable part on the work of a rogues gallery of crime thinkers such as Gregory Cochran on Jewish IQ, Richard Lin on global IQ, Ron Unz on Chinese social Darwinism, Gregory Clark on the evolution of the bourgeois virtues among the English, and Steven Pinker on the decline in violence. Personally, I know some of these people, which is helpful in reading Wade, since he won't tell the reader anything, even though some of them are pretty interesting. For example, during his anthropology fieldwork, Henry Harpending found he loved life in Africa so much that he almost quit academia to become a great white hunter guiding safaris. That's a pretty good anecdote there. But Wade has no time for scientists' personal idiosyncrasies. He's interested in not just explaining the solid science of race, but in also sketching out a more speculative theory of how history has been driven by racial differences in evolution. So I want an income like any bloke. I want success in my career. Of course, I'd love to be writing for the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Los Angeles Times and appearing on ABC News. But long ago, I decided it was more important to me to tell the truth the best I knew how. Of course, I've made mistakes. I have not always had as much courage as I should have had. I've not always had as much clarity as I should have had. But my primary agenda, as far as I'm conscious of it, is to tell the truth And in every age, there are all sorts of truths that you're not allowed to state publicly without severe blowback. And that's just the nature of reality. And I want to embrace reality. And I'm willing to give up my ambitions for a smaller platform where I can simply try to tell more of the truth. Nicholas Wade writes, though there is still a large random element, the broad general theme of human history is that each race has developed the institutions appropriate to secure survival in its particular environment. He notes the view of economic development generally taken by economists is that people have little or nothing to do with it, since all humans are identical units that respond the same way to incentives, at least in economic theory. Then if one country is poor and another rich, the differences cannot have anything to do with the people, but must lie in institutions or access to resources. Thus, on the basis of this theory, the West has spent some $2.3 trillion in aid over the last 50 years without managing to improve African living standards. Could something be not quite right with the theory? Extrapolating from Gregory Clark's 2007 book, A Farewell to Arms, which argued for the evolutionary benefits to Eurasians of being selected for fitness to survive in densely populated or otherwise difficult regions, Nicholas Wade observes. African populations have not gone through the same Malthusian ringer that shaped the behavior of the European and East Asian populations. Between 1200 and 1800, the English, adapting to the harsh pressures of an intense agrarian economy, became less violent, more literate, and more willing to save for the future. In Africa, population pressure has long been much lower than in Europe and Asia. So I want to play a little bit more here from Nicholas Wade talking with Jared Taylor.
A book like The Bell Curve, for example, was never translated into any German language, despite its impact here. And I would suspect that your book, I hope that your publisher, Penguin, is looking for translation rights into European languages or any other language. But my suspicion is your publisher is not succeeding.
Well, you're right. It hasn't placed the German rights, but it has placed rights in several other languages. So the book is not doing too badly.
In which language? Into which languages will it be translated?
Well, I think it's going into Italian and Spanish, Japanese and Chinese so far.
Well, isn't that interesting? That I'd say bravo for the Italians and the Spanish. I'm not at all surprised that the Japanese are interested in the book. I recall The Bell Curve was translated into Japanese. Phil Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior had considerable success in Japan. The Japanese are not startled or surprised by this kind of thing. In fact, I remember once when The Bell Curve came out, I was speaking with some Japanese associates, and they'd heard of The Bell Curve, and they wanted to know what all the fuss was about. And I took a few minutes to summarize the contents of the book, not dwelling on the racial aspect, but not excluding that either. And afterwards they sort of looked at each other and said, well, doesn't everybody know that? So it's not scandalous to them, but you're suggesting that this closed-mindedness or this, well, I don't know if it's not closed-mindedness, at least a kind of defensiveness or an obscurantism is limited really to the academic left of the United States.
And let me read more here from Steve Saylor. European cultures tried to keep population below the famine level by inculcating the sexual restraint and romantic choosiness conducive to relatively late marriages, while East Asian cultures cultivated grinding work ethics. In most of tropical Africa, however, the infectious disease burden was so lethal that dense populations could not be achieved due to epidemics. So the population could not form cities nor even fully farm the countryside. The big danger in Africa was not Malthusian overpopulation, but underpopulation, which may account for how sexualized their cultures are. Not surprisingly, each continent's culture seems to have bred people befitting its environment, and their traits live on in their descendants in modern America. Nicholas Wade ends with an injunction that may seem familiar. Knowledge is usually considered a better basis for policy than ignorance. Okay, back to Nicholas Wade's book. In almost all societies since the invention of agriculture, most people, aside from the ruling elite, have lived under these harsh conditions. England probably did not differ from other agrarian societies in Europe and East Asia between 1200 and 1800, except that the economic conditions of its Malthusian trap are unusually well documented. Malthus, strangely enough, wrote his essay at the very moment when England, shortly followed by other European countries, was about to escape the Malthusian trap. The escape consisted of such a substantial increase in production efficiency that extra workers enhanced incomes instead of constraining them. This development, known as the Industrial Revolution, is the salient event in economic history. Yet economic historians have reached no agreement on how to account for it. Much of modern social science originated in efforts by late 19th and 20th century Europeans to understand what made the economic development path of Western Europe unique, yet these efforts have yielded no consensus, writes historian Kenneth Pomerantz. Some experts argue that demography was the real driver. The plethora of explanations, and that none of them is satisfying to all experts, points strongly to the need for an entirely new category of explanation. Gregory Clark has provided one by daring to look at a plausible yet unexamined possibility that productivity increased because the nature of people had changed. So all modern dog breeds have been developed and honed and selectively bred in the last 500 years. Maybe the nature of people has changed in the last 1,000 years as well. Gregory Clark's proposal is a challenge to conventional thinking because economists tend to treat people everywhere as identical. None would suggest that the Stone Age economics in which New Guinean societies were living when discovered by Europeans had anything to do with the nature of New Guineans. Provided with the same incentives, resources, and knowledge base, New Guineans would develop economies similar to that of Europeans, most economists would say. Few economists have recognized the implausibility of this position and have begun to ask if the nature of the humble human units that produce and consume all of an economy's goods and services might possibly have some bearing on its performance. They have discussed human quality, but by this they usually mean just education and training. None has dared to say the culture might include an evolutionary change in behavior, though nor do they explicitly exclude this possibility. So let's go back to Malthus. Malthus's essay had a profound effect on Charles Darwin. It was from Malthus that Darwin derived the principle of natural selection, the central mechanism in his theory of evolution. If people were struggling on the edge of starvation, competing to survive, then the slightest advantage would be decisive, Darwin realized, and the owner would bequeath that advantage to his children. These children and their offspring would thrive, while others would perish. In October 1838, that is 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, Darwin wrote in his autobiography, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population. How many people in the chat have read for amusement Malthus on population? And being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then I had at least got a theory by which to work. So are there any news stories that you guys want to discuss? Given the correctness of Darwin's theory, there is no reason to doubt that natural selection was working on the very English population that provided the evidence for it. The critical issue then is that of just what traits were being selected for. Gregory Clark had documented 4 behaviors that steadily changed in the English population between the years 1200 and 1800, as well as a plausible mechanism of change. The 4 behaviors are those of interpersonal violence, literacy, the propensity to save, and the propensity to work. Homicide rates for males, for instance, declined from 0.3 per thousand in 1200 to 0.1 in 1600 and to about a tenth of this in 1800. Even from the beginning of this period, the level of personal violence was well below that of modern hunter-gatherer societies. So here's a chart on homicide rates for males in England between the years 1190 and 2000. A pretty stunning decline in murder. Literacy rates can be estimated from the proportion of people who spell out their names on documents such as marriage registers and court documents instead of signing with an X. I'll never forget my shock. I went back to Australia in June of 1984, and I was at a party one night. We were playing a movie and had some friends over, and there was like words in the movie. As you'll see, they'll come on the screen, some explanation, and this wife was reading them aloud to her husband, and I thought she was mocking me, and I said, I can read, and she said something like, Johnny has dyslexia, and I was absolutely shocked that her husband could not read. Like, seemed like a smart guy, he was very funny, he was a great mate, loved Johnny. I was shocked. I think it's the first person I knew who couldn't read. Like, whoa! I mean, he worked in some craft, like a fitter and something like that. Some practical task. He was doing his job well. He married an attractive, intelligent woman. He had children, and I was just shocked that this guy could not read. I ran into him in 2014 when I went back to Australia, and he was preparing to go with his wife to the World Cup in Brazil. So he earned a good living. He provided for his family. His wife was above average in intelligence. And I was absolutely shocked that this bloke could not read. All right, so here is a chart on literacy rates among men and women in England between 1580 and 1920. A very substantial increase over that time. Literacy rate among English men climbed steadily from about 30% in 1580 to above 60% by 1800. Most Jewish men have been literate for 2,000 years. Most Jewish women have been literate for at least 300 years. And in the chat, Glib Medley says, Daniel, he streamed some black porn. He was watching on Claire Corr's stream. Poor guy, the Jews got him hooked. The Jews made him watch black men on white women porn. Sad. Blame the Jews for that. Work hours steadily increased throughout the period and interest rates fell. When inflation and risk are subtracted, an interest rate reflects the compensation that a person will demand to postpone immediate gratification by postponing consumption of a good from now until a future date. Economists call this attitude time preference, and psychologists call it delayed gratification. Children who are generally not so good at delaying gratification are said to have a high time preference. In his celebrated marshmallow test, the psychologist Walter Mischel tested young children as to their preference for receiving one marshmallow now or two in 15 minutes. This simple decision turned out to have far-reaching consequences. Those able to hold out for the larger reward had higher SAT scores and social competence in later life. Children have a very high time preference, which falls as they grow older and develop more self-control. So there's a reason that rental car companies only, generally speaking, rent cars to people starting at age 25, because that is the age when the prefrontal cortex right here fully comes online. So you can see my prefrontal cortex was probably damaged in a car accident that I had when I was 19. I was changing the station on my 1968 VW Bug in September of 1985, and I ran my Volkswagen Bug like right into a parked school bus. I hit it at about 20, 30 miles an hour. I had my seatbelt on, but still my head hit the steering wheel. First time in my life. I needed stitches. The ambulance came, and I remember I was in the ambulance, and the people in the ambulance were like talking about, you know, what they'd been doing that weekend and what their plans were. And I'm thinking, here I am, like I've just been in a car accident, and you guys are just talking about your social life. Live Madly notes that Mossad hacked his computer, putting all that porn on because he's such a threat to Jewish power. Time preferences are also high among hunter-gatherers. American 6-year-olds have a time preference of about 3% per day or 150% per month. This is the extra reward that must be offered on average to delay instant gratification. So interest rates, which reflect a society's time preferences, have been very high, about 10% from the earliest historical times, and for all societies before 1400, the Common Era, for which there is data. Interest rates then entered a period of steady decline, reaching about 3% by 1850. Because inflation and other pressures on interest rates were largely absent, the falling interest rates indicate that people were becoming less impulsive, more patient, and more willing to save. Let me play a little bit more from this discussion between Jared Taylor and Nicholas Wade.
You would probably know best as a science writer, but what makes you think that it is limited in that way? It seems to me it's pretty widespread.
Well, you may be right. I'm not well informed about the situation in other countries. So the virus may have spread elsewhere, but I think this is a problem of the academic left rather than of the Western world as a whole. I certainly hope that's the case.
Well, yes, we can all certainly hope that. I'm sure you're aware of the Beijing Genomics Institute. They seem to be, for our listeners who may not be aware of it, I understand it to be a fairly, quite well-funded government enterprise that's busily trying to determine the genetic basis for intelligence and perhaps other desirable characteristics, that they are taking the genetic basis for this sort of thing very seriously, that they hope to find out how to manipulate the genome in useful ways. And if this is something that at which the Chinese succeed, but that which we are not willing, there be dragons in our view, and we're not going to try any of that, is there a possibility that we could be left behind by the Chinese?
Well, that's certainly an interesting thought. That particular experiment you mentioned on looking for genes for IQ, I think, in fact, it was devised by an American psychologist working in London, Dr. Plomin, who's been interested in intelligence for many years. So I think what the Chinese have is Plomin's mathematically gifted children from the US. I think that's right, but I'm not sure. And I think they've added a cohort of their own. So they have a quite interesting mixed experiment going on. Whether or not they'll be successful, I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to find genes for IQ. They certainly exist, but I think the situation is that instead of there being a sort of few easily discernible genes, there are a very large number of genes, each of which has a very small effect, an effect so tiny it's very hard to pick it up. So I think it's sort of it's an entirely open question as to whether the Beijing Genomics Institute will succeed.
Is that right? Yeah, I tend to be more struck by the extraordinary progress that's been made in decoding the genome, and it's my expectation that the alleles for high intelligence, as well as many other characteristics, are likely to be found within the next several decades. Are you more pessimistic in that respect?
Well, it's just a matter of how much money one's prepared to invest. I think you're right. We may start to find quite a few of them over the next decade. I think I'm right in saying that as of now, there are no or very few alleles for intelligence that have been sort of confirmed beyond any doubt. So we're right at the beginning of this episode. So I'm sure we'll pick up a few more alleles as time goes on, but how much they will tell us remains to be seen. Of course, and the hope is they'll tell us how the brain works. But this is a very complicated issue, and these alleles will provide just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, let's get back to this book by Nicholas Wade. Because inflation and other pressures on interest rates were largely absent, the falling interest rates indicate that people were becoming less impulsive, more patient, and more willing to save. These behavioral changes in the English population between the years 1200 and 1800 were of pivotal economic importance. They gradually transformed a violent and undisciplined peasant population into an efficient and productive workforce. Turning up punctually for work every day and enduring 8 hours or more of repetitive labor is far from being a natural human behavior. Hunter-gatherers do not willingly embrace such occupations, but agrarian societies from their beginning demanded the discipline to labor in the fields and to plant and harvest at the correct times. Disciplined behaviors were probably gradually evolving within the agrarian English population for many centuries before the year 1200, the point at which they can be documented. Growth in productive efficiency makes all the difference to economic output on which a population's prosperity and survival depend. In 1760, just as the Industrial Revolution was about to take off, 18 hours of labor were required to transform a pound of cotton into cloth. A century later, only 1.5 hours were needed. Better technology played a large role in the growth in efficiency. The difference was made not so much by the major inventions beloved of historians, such as the spinning jenny, but by a continuous stream of incremental improvements as workers drew from and improved upon an expanding pool of common technical knowledge. Gregory Clark has uncovered the simple genetic mechanism through which the Malthusian economy wrought these changes on the English population. The rich had more surviving children than did the poor. Unlike the Western world since about 1850, when the poor have had more surviving children than the rich, that's why we have been steadily getting stupider in the West. From a study of wills made between 1585 and 1638, finds that will makers with 9 pounds or less to leave their heirs had, on average, just under 2 children. The number of heirs rose steadily with assets, such that men with more than 1,000 pounds in their gift, who formed the wealthiest asset class, left just over 4 children. So let's see. Hey, we've got some... Hey, Mr. Glib, what's going on, sir? Yes, you're on, and you're loud, and you're clear, and you're beautiful. Oh, this is so exciting. It's been a long time, bro. I wish you're on the show every day. You say so many wonderful things in the chat. You're the all-time king of chat. Oh no, there's a technical problem and people can't hear you. Oh, and that is a problem on my end. Like, there's nothing you're doing wrong. Damn. Yeah. Okay. 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 Great. Okay, I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know why I'm not hearing Glib. I've gotta figure out my sound issues. Doggone it! I thought I had them figured out, and I didn't. So, doggone it. Okay. Let me. Silly here. Why, oh Lord? Why can't I hear Mr. Glib? Doggone it. Okay, I'll do a solo stream and then figure things out. All right, the English population was fairly stable in size from 1200 to 1760. In this context, that the rich were having more children than the poor led to the interesting phenomenon of unremitting social descent. Most children of the rich had to sink in the social scale, given that there were too many of them to remain in the upper class. Their social descent had the far-reaching genetic consequence that they carried with them inheritance for the same behaviors that had made their parents rich. The values of the upper middle class, nonviolence, literacy, thrift, and patience, were thus infused into lower economic classes and throughout society. Generation after generation, they gradually became the values of the society as a whole. This explains the steady decrease in violence and increase in literacy that Clarke has documented for the English population. Moreover, the behaviors emerged gradually over several centuries, a time course more typical of an evolutionary change than a cultural change. So I'm going to wind up the stream early and try to figure out these audio issues. So sorry, folks. Bye-bye.